Okay, well, thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm sure most of you have heard something about above the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, and so I'll try to give you a little bit more information that I hope you find useful, and happy to answer questions either at the end, or if something's not clear, it's okay for me if you interrupt and just ask. So above is a large-scale NASA-led study of environmental change in the Arctic and boreal regions in North America. I'll show you the study domain shortly, and the implications for ecological systems and society. So that's quite a lot. That's a big, long sentence you see at the top of the slide, and I will try to walk you through exactly what we mean by that. The overarching science question is how vulnerable or resilient are ecosystems and society to environmental change in the Arctic and boreal regions of Western North America. And the two slides shown here are the one on the left, or the two pictures shown here. The one on the left is a photograph of the Antagonistic River fire, where there's a flux tower taking measurements. That's a tundra fire on the north slope of Alaska. And the photo on the right is these large fires that took place in the Northwest Territories of Canada a couple of years ago. So you get an idea of the combustion that's taking place of the soils as well as the trees. So the study domain is, hopefully you have that slide up. It ranges from Alaska in the west all the way across to Hudson's Bay on the eastern end. So there are a couple different definitions of the study domain. Outlined in red is what we call the core domain. That's where most of the activities will be taking place. And then what's outlined in purple is an extended domain that includes a bit more of the high Arctic as well as further south in the southern end of the boreal system of North America. So shown on the map are a few of the core locations where we expect to be working, where we will be working. So certainly around interior Alaska, Fairbanks area, down to Delta Junction, up the Dalton Highway, up to the North Slope, through the Tulik Long-Term Experimental Research Site, and Barrow, where NG Arctic is working, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and links with them shortly. And then in Canada, those big red blotches in the middle of the map indicate these fire events, which I just showed you a photograph of, an example of. So there is a lot of activity that we'll be focusing on there in terms of disturbance regimes and what happens after disturbance in terms of recovery. And then there's a bunch of little dots on there that are permanent plot samples at the southern end of the boreal, where forest stands have been monitored for a number of years, and we're studying those in terms of what's happening in boreal forest productivity and mortality and so on. So this is the extent of the domain where most, well, in terms of above, where all of the field activities will be taking place. There will also be aircraft remote sensing campaign and airborne science component to above that'll be starting up. We're starting to organize that now, but that'll be coming in a year or so. So this is where the focus of activity will be, but of course all the effort is in terms of linking field measurements with remote sensing so that we can develop algorithms that map over much larger areas. So, you know, taking it to a circumarctic scale. And the same is true with models. The field measurements and the remote sensing will inform models that will be operated not just in this domain, but across the whole pan-Arctic, pan-boreal domain. So that's important to keep in mind. There's a whole lot. It's a very big study area, but there's a whole lot more of the Boreal and Arctic region spanning Russia, Siberia, and so on. Okay, so the next slide is what we are calling our vulnerability assessment framework. This graphic is out of our experiment plan, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But it gives you some idea of the efforts in terms of characterizing ecosystems, the components of ecosystems, whether it's permafrost, the vegetation, fauna, hydrology, what's happening with carbon stocks and fluxes, and how those changes in ecosystems impact the services they provide in terms of climate regulation, in terms of cultural resources, natural resources, and so on. And how those services then and changes in those service provisioning has consequences for society. So those include things like how we use resources, human health, infrastructure, subsistence activities, and in turn then how society responds to those changes also feeds into additional changes, whether in terms of disturbance or climate change, mitigation or adaptation, and land management activities. And then those, to fulfill the cycle, then those are drivers of additional changes to ecosystems. So you can imagine this, this series of interactions and feedbacks either mitigating additional change or exacerbating additional change in ecosystems and all the services they provide and the impacts that has on people. So that's the general vulnerability framework that we're working through. The next slide is really a list of science questions that we've developed. I won't go through these other than, I certainly won't read through them. You can do that at your leisure, but they include addressing ecosystem services, disturbance regimes, permafrost, hydrology, flora and fauna, carbon, biogeochemistry, nitrogen cycling. All these are key science questions that above will be focused on addressing. And then the next slide are objectives that we've laid out. In this case, specifically in the context of ecosystem dynamics. So again, I won't read through these, but just to point out that some of the objectives are focused on permafrost vulnerability and resilience, which of course there's tremendous interest in now. How biology and biological controls influence how ecosystems respond to disturbance, including climate change. Vegetation attributes and hydrological conditions, how those in turn influence disturbance and feedback to disturbance. Snow properties. Snow is very important, of course, in these systems in terms of regulating all sorts of biogeochemical and ecosystem processes. And the non-growing season part of the year is often very much understudied, so we hope to address that. We plan to address that as part of above as well. It's a key part that's often underrepresented. Vegetation productivity changes, understanding what's happening with those. So this includes things like Arctic greening, areas where we see boreal browning, in other words, declines in productivity. And then objectives related again to carbon biogeochemistry and fish and wildlife habitat and their interactions and patterns and gradients with climate and disturbance. So those are some of the objectives we're focused on. The next slide is a graphic that's out of the IPCC fifth assessment report that I was involved with, the working group 2, and we put together this graphic which I think nicely captures what above we'll be focusing on in terms of climate feedbacks and a lot of these science questions and objectives I just went through quickly. So the graphic shows at the southern end of the boreal trees and changes in productivity, tree mortality, fire disturbance, how that fire disturbance influences the active layer and permafrost as the organic soil is burned off. And then further north in the tundra systems, shrub expansion and densification and the implications for that in terms of carbon and albedo feedbacks and energy balance, changes in lakes. There's already been a pre-above study that produced a nice data set mapping lakes and changes in lake cover, and some of those lakes are disappearing, some are expanding, and it's all related to the hydrology, the subsurface hydrology and where the water goes, wetlands and carbon emissions, and then in the coastal zone, how changes in the sea ice extent influence the energy balance and the impact on land. So warming, a longer period of open water also warms adjacent lands, and that influences productivity of the vegetation and other ecosystem changes as well. So this is kind of a graphic representation of all those processes taking place that we'll be studying and how they feed back ultimately to climate change, both in a positive and a negative sense. In other words, mitigating or exacerbating future change. So the next slide, I won't go into it all really, but it's above science objectives that are focused on ecosystem services. We have a couple of above projects funded now that have a ecosystem service component, and quite a few others, especially that address land management and working with a number of land management agencies. So this is a part of above that will really phase in much more in later stages, but it's already started in a number of above projects. And so I'll run through some of those shortly, give you some sense of the projects. In terms of the timing for above, it's laid out in 3 phases, and we've just started what is phase 1, which is focused on the ecosystem dynamics objectives that I went through. Phase 2 will be focusing more on these ecosystem service objectives that I just went through very quickly. And then phase 3 is ultimately a synthesis and analysis phase, but really there will be, of course, analysis and synthesis activities that happen through the whole, through all the phases of above. But this gives you some idea of the range of research focus areas, which include field-based work, remote sensing work, modeling work, integration and scaling, and how they phase in, at least ideally in this graphic, in an idealized sense, how they phase in and maybe not phase out again, but are more intense in certain different phases of above, which is laid out as an 8 to 10 year program. So it's fair to say it's a significant and ambitious program over 10 years that will involve, by the end of it, hundreds of scientists and hundreds of additional collaborators. So I think it's worth, the next slide, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense for the development of above, how it came about, because I won't spend a great deal of time on it, but I think it's important to appreciate that this was quite a long process that involved a lot of input from a whole range of different groups, from a very broad community. So the initial proposal was written in 2008 and selected in early 2009, and we had a workshop that year that involved some 90 participants in Fairbanks, and we submitted a quite substantive scoping study. I think it was 90-some pages, and we posted that study online and solicited scientific community feedback on it. And so one of the ways that we did that, well, the next slide is just the cover for the scoping study. It was led by Eric Kosiski, who's now doing a visiting project scientist position at NASA headquarters, myself, John Kimball, and Michelle Mack. So this was this fairly substantive scoping study report that went out. One of the ways that we solicited community input was by trying to make as many people aware of it as possible. So notice of it went out to a lot of email lists, and we also wrote a short piece, longer than what's shown on this slide. It's a couple pages, but a short piece saying that the scoping study had been completed and we're soliciting input from people. So we did that. We got quite a few comments. I don't remember the exact number, but quite a lot. And those were reviewed by an expert committee that NASA headquarters put together. They reviewed the scoping study document and all the feedback that we got and said, this is fantastic, it's very ambitious, it's great, it's what we really need to do, but really you should do even more. You should consider the coastal zone and you should focus more on the human dimensions. So we took that to heart. We held another workshop that invited some 100 participants. This is in mid-2012, and we released a report on that activity, and that is, all this is available, by the way, at the above website, above.nasa.gov. So that report is 70-some pages, and that was out there as well. So at that point, I think it's fair to say we moved to a stage where then we were ready to go forward. NASA was ready to go forward with this, and so they solicited and formed a science definition team of some 26 members across a whole range of disciplines. And in 2013, we held 4 workshops throughout the year to put together what's the concise experiment plan. And here, this next slide just shows the cover of that. It's a pretty substantial document, and again, it's available through the website, and it lays out in quite a lot of detail what the science questions, objectives, and approach, and infrastructure, and so on would be. Now we're moving to transform this experiment plan into an implementation plan. So the work goes on in terms of laying out exactly what we'll do. But where we are now is that we're into phase 1. We've had 21 core science teams selected through solicitation at the end of last year, and we held our first science team meeting just recently at the end of September, early October this year. And so we have these 21 projects, as well as 7 projects that were funded by NASA previously to produce data products relevant to above. There are another 7 projects that were funded by NASA, other programs within NASA, so for example, carbon cycle science or interdisciplinary science programs. So those were very relevant to above. They're within the study domain and address the above objectives, so those are included as well. A couple of NASA Earth Science Fellowships. There will certainly be more of these as we go forward. And then at least one project so far that's supported by the Canadian High Arctic Research Station. I'll say a little bit more about that. But basically that means we've got 32 science teams currently, or 38 science teams currently as part of above activities. And just to give you a little bit of a sense for how that breaks out, it's 100 funded investigators at this point, 131 collaborators, so over 200 investigators now involved from more than 100 organizations, mostly within the U.S. and Canada, but we expect that to expand, again, as above evolves through these various phases. So it's a significant effort that's underway. In terms of organization, above is run out of NASA's terrestrial ecology program, and Hank Margolis is the program manager, following in the footsteps of Diane Wickland, who is the program manager there for some 30 years. so Hank has big shoes he's filling at this point, and also Eric Kosiski, again, is doing a stint at NASA headquarters, so that's in the terrestrial ecology program. And then, as I mentioned, there are these other NASA programs, interdisciplinary science and carbon cycle science, that will support above activities as well as partner organizations. So I'm the science lead. Chip Miller is the deputy science lead working with me, and Chip's forte is really the airborne science component. That's what he'll be primarily focused on, although he's involved in all of our weekly tag-ups. And then NASA has their Carbon Cycle and Ecosystem Program Office at NASA Goddard. It's led by Peter Griffiths, and that group is really critical to moving above forward, and they've been great in terms of putting the infrastructure together and interacting with the principal investigators. And we have an above science computing cloud where data are stored, and the investigators analyze data and so on. So they're responsible for a tremendous amount of activities, and Libby Larson is part of that effort as well. Liz Hoy, Dan Hutchinson, so great group. And then, of course, there's the Above Science team, and we have core projects and affiliated projects. And the affiliated can be funded either by NASA or by partner organizations. There's been a lot of interest in how can I be involved with Above. So we've spent some time outlining that and creating guidelines, and those are posted on the website. I won't go into them here, but basically it's a small proposal that we assess for a number of criteria. So we welcome projects, affiliated projects. We're just also at the same time want to make sure that they're highly relevant to the objectives of Above, which is okay. So the next slide, I just wanted to point out a couple of the key partners, and these are really key partners because of the scope of their activity. So the NG Arctic experiment, it's largely focused around the Barrow area currently, but they're wrapping up their phase 1 activities. They'll have a phase 2 that's including intensive studies on the Seward Peninsula in Alaska, both of these. So we will work with them closely on scaling, bringing more remote sensing and scaling and innovation activities through Above to the work that they're doing at their core study sites with the objective of improving the representation of permafrost in their system models. So NG Arctic is a core key partner of Above, as is the activities of Polar Knowledge Canada, which is Canada's polar research program writ large, and the Canadian High Arctic Research Station is a key part of that, where they're building a pretty impressive facility in Cambridge Bay that will house investigators, and so they're a key partner as well in this, and they will co-fund projects. They are co-funding projects that are part of Above, and they're strategically located in the Northwest Passage, where there will be a lot more activity in years coming very soon as the sea ice-free period is extended. So critically located and a key partner of Above. In terms of how Above is organized, we've got a series of working groups that follow the objectives, largely follow the objectives that I laid out earlier. Each of these working groups has a lead designated, so they include, in terms of flora or vegetation dynamics and distribution, vegetation structure and function, fauna, how animals and habitat move across habitat in the domain, fire and insect disturbance, especially fire disturbance is a big part of the activities. Carbon dynamics and biogeochemistry, hydrology, permafrost is a key one. We have a whole modeling team and modeling framework and model and comparison activities that will be that'll be a key part of and ramp up quite a bit quite soon. And ecosystem services I mentioned, and then a whole airborne science component that'll be coming online. And then there'll be other ad hoc working groups formed that, for things like which core variables and geospatial products that are produced by the projects and so on. So this is how we've currently laid out the disciplinary aspects of above. But really what above is all about is coordinating across disciplines and facilitating each other's activities and working together, because above is and will be more than just a group of projects that are independent. They will work very closely together through regular science team meetings and coordinated field activities, with the whole idea being that we can learn a lot more in an interdisciplinary sense by helping each other and sharing data collection protocols and sharing where we work and collecting additional variables in some cases to help other teams and so on, things like that. So that'll let us get at the interactions that are taking place, how vegetation and animals and wildlife are moving across the landscape and how they're impacted by ecosystem disturbance and climate change, for instance. Fire and vegetation recovery, what happens after fire and how does that impact carbon cycling and fauna and so on. How does fire interact with permafrost in terms of exacerbating permafrost thaw and biogeochemistry that takes place with permafrost thaw. And permafrost hydrology interactions, another key area. So really it's all about this interdisciplinary work that'll be key to above and the success of above. So there'll be a lot of science results coming in the future, so I'd be happy to come back at a future time and report on those. I do have a couple more slides that I can show you on what I think will be some of the key results that come forward, so I can just go through those, and then we can have questions. I just have a few of these just to give you some idea of some past work that I think we'll be able to build substantially on. And the key part of that is this slide I'm showing that's what's likely to happen in the future in terms of the distribution of vegetation in the Arctic. So there are a couple maps here showing the current distribution of vegetation on the left from the Circumpolar Arctic Vegetation Map. It's a map produced by experts of where vegetation is currently distributed. And then predictions of out to 2050, what that's likely to look like under climate change scenarios. And there are a whole bunch of scenarios that were run for this, but you get the idea that there will be substantial vegetation changes. So that the photo shows what we mean by, for example, these green areas that appear on the North Slope or where trees are present. That doesn't mean there'll be suddenly a boreal forest established there, but there will be trees present, and that has big implications for what happens in terms of energy balance, how snow collects around them and changes the carbon in biogeochemistry, nutrient cycling, and so on. So there'd be big implications of the presence of trees and densification of shrubs on the North Slope. And that changes albedo. So this slide is just showing a couple, what the albedo implications will be in terms of these predicted scenarios of vegetation distribution. In other words, there'll be a lot darker surface and lower albedos. That in turn changes the whole net shortwave radiation balance because of the energy absorbed by the dark vegetation, and that will have significant feedback effects, as I mentioned, on carbon and energy cycling. But the key message, I think, from this work is that these vegetation changes in terms of their feedbacks to climate will be largely in terms of the energy balance, these albedo energy balance effects. So really the Arctic, the key component is it acts as this biophysical medium in terms of energy balance, because by comparison, the carbon accumulated in vegetation biomass growth is small by comparison, as are evapotranspiration changes. So I think this is some area that above will really be able to help us get a better handle on in terms of the rate and magnitude of feedbacks from vegetation changes taking place. And then just one other example where I think above will really take things forward is in terms of fire disturbance and how that influences permafrost thaw and mobilizes ancient carbon that's been stored in permafrost for thousands of years. So these are just a couple of photos that Tor Jorgensen provided me showing post-fire effects on just surface hydrology from permafrost thawing as the vegetation is burned off. And you see all the standing water around that results from these fires. And I think it's fair to say, this is my last slide, that these kind of changes in their importance and potential magnitude is percolated up to the very top. So this is President Obama and his presentation that he made at the glacier meeting this year. These are all Arctic policy people present from around the Arctic, where he really just directly called out the importance of permafrost, the potential of permafrost thaw to really feed back to climate in a what he called a negative feedback, but really is a positive feedback. In other words, it has the potential to really produce a lot of carbon emissions that could end up in the atmosphere, equivalent to adding a whole nother United States in terms of emissions to the atmosphere that really aren't even accounted for in current negotiations taking place to reduce fossil fuel emissions. So part of our hope and agenda is that we get this knowledge and information out to policymakers to make it even more clear that there's urgency in terms of reducing fossil fuel emissions. So that was it. Thank you very much again for having me, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Great, thanks so much, Scott. That was a fantastic presentation. Does anyone have questions?
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you, Jason.
Yeah, so Jason Taylor from BLM, Alaska. Scott, that was a great presentation. The more I learn about above, the more impressed I am. So I know you said that the land management component was kind of down the road. I guess I just wanted to throw out there that certainly me and I think BLM Alaska in general are interested in learning more about that land management piece, and certainly interested in being part of that dialogue as that portion matures. And so I've got maybe two related questions. One is, in the map there toward the beginning, you showed potential field-based data collection sites. I'm wondering what considerations have been made for agency-based monitoring programs. You know, BLM Alaska and certainly the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife and others are doing a lot of monitoring in Alaska on the North Slope, pretty fairly quantitative, semi-quantitative stuff that hopefully could be meaningful to the above program. And so curious what thinking has taken place around engaging the agencies for their monitoring programs. And then also there was a lot of kind of introduction of science and science teams, and rightfully so, but I'm curious if there have been kind of, we'll call them land management teams, so to speak, so those people that can help set the stage in on the front end to help better with science integration on the back end.
Yeah, those are great questions. A number of the current funded above projects have collaborators, or perhaps in some cases co-investigators, who are from various land management agencies. And I can't tell you right off the top of my head whether BLM is on one of those, but I welcome having BLM activities represented as part of above. I think that's critical. We've got Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, both in Alaska and Canada, and others, a whole range of other partners. And what we're having our second science team meeting in third week of January in Anchorage, and would love to have someone from BLM present there, and we'll have these other agencies represented there as well. We're trying, currently we're moving quickly to try to identify the best people to invite from that. Would certainly like to invite people who are already working with above projects, but even beyond that, you know, sort of program manager level people, as well as some science research people from the agencies present there.
Hey, Scott, this is Libby. Can I interject for a second here?
Yes, please. Yep, sure.
So the other thing that's happened is that for the past couple of years, myself and Eric Kashishki, this was before Hank Margulis had come on, and when Diane was still here, up until when Diane was still at NASA, we'd also been giving briefings at the sort of headquarters, DC, mostly in the DC area, to a whole bunch of different agencies here, including folks with BLM, and learning about all of the various sort of monitoring activities, et cetera. And then a sort of key connection to BLM, I know that it's not directly a BLM, but my understanding is that the North Slope Science Initiative is like John Payne is originally a BLM person or something. So we've had that connection as well.
Yep, and I work closely with John, and I know Eric, and yeah, so I'm happy to hear that those initial connections were made, and maybe we can continue to strengthen that. And I'm happy to Scott send along contact information for me, and I'll CC Eric and others, just reiterating my interest. And then if you look out for that and just loop me in, I'd be happy to contribute.
I'm sorry, you said sending along contact information for the what?
No, just for myself to BLM Alaska, for myself to Scott and Eric and whoever else I might need to make sure that we continue to be wrapped in.
I missed hearing what your name was.
Jason Taylor. I'm the Landscape and Arctic Initiatives Coordinator for BLM Alaska.
Oh, okay, great. All right.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it would be good to hear from you, and then we'll follow up. So to your other question, I think it was more in terms of the site data and other data sets that you have and other agencies have. Yeah, I think we recognize that there's a tremendous amount of activity already taking place in these areas and all these different agencies. And so a number of the projects are using field site data, for example, from Park Service, and BLM has more, Fish and Wildlife and so on. So, yeah, the more of that we know about and can work with and work closely with all of you, the better.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much. Does anyone else have any quick questions? We have a few minutes left.
Yeah, this is Allison York with the Alaska Fire Science Consortium. We're one of the people that you guys have contacted as a potential partner organization, and it's still not clear to us from reading the material that's on the website about the process of becoming a partner organization, whether and this I think is relevant to Jason's questions about BLM cooperation. It's not clear to us whether there's any additional resources that are going to be coming forward to support those kinds of partnerships, or if those are expected to be essentially a pro bono contribution from the partner organization.
My understanding is that in developing the partners, that since they're not at the level of say establishing MOUs and having that sort of level of engagement, but more sort of a statement of sharing joint interest and wanting to be sure to try to coordinate activities, and that, so I'm assuming when you say it's for the partners that you got an email from Hank Margulis outlining what the partnership.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's not money that's specifically associated with that. I think that the idea was that we wanted to be sure that we were, having good communications and with the people who are already doing work in the area, and trying to be sure that we could coordinate and integrate that work with the work that we're funding to do through Above.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful.
Hopefully you're still interested.
Well, I have to be frank with you. I think that you should maybe rethink that, given the kind of situation that most of the land management and state management agencies are in Alaska, and you'll get a different level of integration and cooperation and stakeholder engagement if there are some resources available.
Yeah, I don't know how things work in terms of interagency transfer of funds, but I do know that there can be agency co-investigators on proposals that can get support through a funded NASA proposal. Beyond that, I don't know that it would be a headquarters issue whether there can be transfer of funds between agencies to support activities. I can tell you, though, that Above is stretched really thin in terms of trying to find the money to support infrastructure for things like flux towers and aircraft and airborne science and so on. So there's a tremendous demand on what's not nearly enough support. But certainly one of the ways to be involved and get resources is through being co-investigators on projects. And there is some of that already.
Yep, I've noticed that. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for this great presentation, and I hope that you guys will visit back with us from time to time to give us some updates on this, or even if you want to send them through to Andrew or myself, and we can always announce them on these calls too if you have more great information like this. I'll also throw out there that this, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, at Above, I guess Libby probably is because she calls into these quite a bit, that we do have 2 milestones related to the CBVM, the Circumboreal Vegetation Map, for this IARPIC group, one to complete the map and another to then harmonize the map with the Arctic map. So I'll be interested in learning more about how that feeds in or can work with Above over time.